OFS Lady here, and I have a problem. One of my favorite dirndls doesn't quite fit me. Join me today as I show you how to make your dirndl fit. The first thing is you put the dress on, put on the bra that you will wear with it. If people put on sports bras, things don't fit the same. And then pull the dress as tight as you'd like it to be. And you might have a friend help you with this, or you could just look down. I have a tape measure here, and I see that around the bust part, if I added 2 inches here, that would be about right. And let me check what it would be around the waist. Again, this might be easier with a friend helping. 2 or so inches here. So the solution is pretty easy. Join me for how to fix your dirndl. When you open up your dirndl, here's your front zipper, and you go to the side seam. You may find that you have a little bit extra fabric here. So on each side of my side seam, I have a little bit of extra fabric times 4. There's this one, and the same thing on the other side. When I open up the seam, I have up at the top, I have 1.25 inches on this side, and I'll have 1.25 inches on the other side, which adds up to 2 inches, 2.5 inches. At the waist, I have about the same amount. I have 1.25 inches. So what I'm going to do is take this whole thing out, and then I'll pin it in place, try it on, and if I see that that's enough, then I'll finish sewing the dress, and I'll make it permanent. The thing you're going to need for this is a seam ripper or a razor blade. When you get up to the top of the seam, you're going to find the stitching, take your razor blade or your seam ripper, and just start kind of hitting these little threads that are holding it together. Once you get it going, you can kind of pull on it. Sometimes when you get past the backtrack stitching, see how I'm just kind of tugging at it? Boop, 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 boop. Now if you have a very old dress, I wouldn't recommend just pulling because your fabric could rip, but this is pretty nice sturdy fabric that I have, so I'm not afraid. After I get the whole thing ripped out all the way to the waist, I have to deal with the part where the skirt is sewn on to the bodice. So now I'm going to take the seam allowance, and I'm going to get my seam ripper under the seam allowance until I free the seam allowance from the top, from the skirt. I'll do the same thing on the other side. This whole process doesn't take very long once you get to it. Now that I've freed up that little seam allowance, I'm going to go to the part where the bodice is sewn on the skirt. And this again isn't very hard. You just have to get in here and find a couple of threads that hold it all together. Now if you're going to take a dress in many inches, you will probably have to, or take it out many inches, you'll have to redo the pleats on the bottom, which isn't a hard thing to do at all either. There we go. Now there's a little hole here between the skirt and the bodice. I'm going to rip the rest of the seam allowance from the side seam out to where we're all the way free. There we go. Okay, got it. Now I know that there's 4 pieces involved here. There's the front and the back on the right, the front and the back on the left. So if I want to make my seams 2 inches bigger, I need to have 1/2 inch on this one and 1/2 inch on this one, and the same thing on the other, because 1/2 inch times 4 adds up to 2 inches. So you don't, it's not very complicated. Now sometimes if I'm going to take in something a lot, I'll use metric measurements. So 2 inches on my tape measure is equal to about 5 centimeters. Sometimes it's easier with centimeters than it is with inches. Now that I have the seam allowance ripped open and I have it removed, ripped open also from the skirt, I'm going to pin the new seam allowance the way I want it to be. And the first pin that you put in, which is going to be closest to your armpit, you need to have the top, the non-sharp side of the pin like this into the armpit. When you go to try it on, if the pokey part's up, it will hurt. So I'm going to pin down through here, and I am a very scant less than a 1/4 inch seam allowance left over because the edges are finished off so nicely I can do that. I would not take my dress in months and months before Oktoberfest if I'm losing or gaining weight, because if you do that, you might have to fix it again when you get closer. And when I get to the bottom, because this is the part that might poke me when I'm trying on, I'm going to have the ball part, the soft or the non-pokey part of the pin down. People don't mind trying on a dress with pins in it as long as the pins are positioned in a way they won't poke them. Now I'm going to do the same on the other side. And I go over here to this seam allowance with my seam ripper, rip out the side stitching. There we go. When it comes to sewing the seam allowance back in, make sure that you pick thread the color of the outside of the dress. Oftentimes the dirndl will be lined with something like a print or white or what have you. If you do, don't match the thread to the inside of the dress because your stitching could possibly show on the outside. And now I'm removing the seam allowance from the skirt. After I get that part done, I'll take the whole bodice just for maybe an inch out. Now if you're going to take your dress in many inches, then you're going to rip the skirt apart from the bodice plenty of inches. In my case, this is not very much. Each of the pieces of the bodice are only going to change by 1/2 inch. And that's not too terribly much. But I do need to get it so it's free from the skirt so that I'll be able to stitch. This whole part, ripping out the seam allowance, takes maybe 5 minutes at the most. Okay, there we go. I've got it all free. Now I'm going to do the same pinning process again, having the non-sharp side of the pin towards the armpit and have the pokey part down. I've had a number of people bring me their dresses when they thought, okay, the dress doesn't fit, I need to get rid of it, and it was as simple as this, to just change the side seam and then the whole dress fit. They didn't notice that the seam allowance was pretty ample. They usually come, if you buy them, they usually come in such a way that you can do that. Again, the bottom of this, the head of the pin should be towards the bottom. I'm going to try this on now. I tried the dress on and it fits. However, I noticed as I was trying it on that this double fold bias tape, which was finishing off the armholes, has started to shred. I don't know if it's very visible on the camera, but it's very visible to me. That means that I'm going to do a little bit of repairs on this dress. It's just like in plumbing, there's always one problem discovered when you start to open up the pipes. I didn't realize until I was starting to take this off how totally shredded this double fold bias tape was. You can see it's just holy as I'm taking it off. Wowzers! I have some extra double fold bias tape, and this is not the extra wide, it's the thin, very same kind that came on this dress. I cut out new strips of the lavender fabric, sewed the double fold bias tape to those strips, pinned them onto the armhole openings, stitched them onto the armhole openings, rolled them over, pinned them in place, top stitched them, and it's looking good. And finally I can finish the side seams. Here we go. Now that the side seam is done, I have to use my seam ripper to rip out the one pleat that's going to be affected here. As I rip that one pleat out, it lays down just right, and so you can see my pleats are real even again because I had taken it in when I lost weight. Okay, so now I'm just going to simply go through here and I'm going to stitch down the bodice to the skirt at the waist. I'll pin it all down first so that nothing will fold into the seam allowance in any way that I don't want. And here we go. I'm going to sew it from the bodice side right here. So that things don't rip out, I always go forward and then backwards. Or you can start by going backwards and then forward, but however it is, you definitely need to go and double over so that it won't have a tendency to rip out. I'm going across the newly created side seam now, and I'll go on past it a little ways, an inch or so, and backtrack again, and that's done other than clipping a few loose threads. I just finished sewing the second side seam, and now I'm coming down here to rip out the pleat and get it. Oh, it already is. Good. Okay. I'm going to stretch it a little bit to where it lines up perfectly. I'll pin it and sew. I don't know about you, but this is so exciting because as soon as I finish this, I'm going to try the dress on, and it will fit. I'm sure of it. Now it's the great moment of truth. Does my dress fit? Yes, it does. Now I'll put on my apron, and I'm ready for October.